Welcome to the Anthony John SCoWI podcast. I am AJ, and tonight we are going to talk about the race for the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the single debate that we've had leading up to it between Chris Taylor of District 4 Court of Appeals and Maria Lazar of District 2 Court of Appeals. I want to start this one with a credibility statement because I think that matters here. I am not coming into this race as a fan of either of these candidates. Before the race even existed, I said publicly to more than 100 of my colleagues during an annual case law presentation that I give that Lazar wrote an opinion that I thought was intellectually dishonest and internally inconsistent. That wasn't campaign rhetoric. That was me as a lawyer reading her work and criticizing it on the merits. So nobody should hear what I'm about to say and think that I'm carrying water for Lazar. I am not a Chris Taylor fan either. When Taylor was on the bench in Dane County, I saw conduct that still pisses me off. A defendant had GPS monitoring as a condition of his bail, but no geographic travel restriction. He went to Europe. Taylor authorized a warrant because apparently the G in GPS stopped meaning global once the plane crossed the Atlantic. So he was detained by Interpol, brought back, taken by the FBI all the way back to Dane County, and sat in a jail past the statutory deadline for a bond hearing because Judge Taylor was on vacation. His lawyer had to file a habeas petition before a duty judge to get the dude's statutory rights enforced. Then Taylor came back early, added a geographic restriction after the fact, and literally told everyone to take a breath. Easy to say when you're the one in a robe and not the one in a jail cell. So I am not carrying water for Taylor either. This is where I'm starting from. I distrust both of them for different reasons. And I'm taking this seriously because I care a lot about the judicial role, more than I care about whether the judicial candidate lines up with me politically. If Chris Taylor were running for governor, I'd probably vote for her. And she's not running for governor. She's running for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the question for me isn't just whose politics I like better. The question is whether either of these people seems likely to understand the discipline of judging. That's why this race is so frustrating. It matters, and the choices suck. I watched the debate hoping it would clarify things, and for a little while I thought it did. I came out of it leaning toward Lazar. Not because I suddenly liked her, but because on the stage, she more often sounded like someone who at least understood the vocabulary of judging. Then I went back, thought more, checked some of the factual disputes between them, and ended up basically where I started. Probably staying at home on this race unless something changes before Tuesday. I don't like that answer. And that's where I am. What I want to do here is to go through what's wrong with both of them, what little is right with both of them, and why this is such an irritating choice if you care about courts as courts and not just as political weapons. The biggest problem with Taylor is that she still sounds like a legislator. She sounds like an advocate, and that goes straight to the job itself. A judge is supposed to decide cases according to law, while restraining policy preferences and the urge to do good as she personally defines it. A judge isn't there to move the ball for her team or to announce her values and then reason backwards. And she's certainly not there to talk like the court exists to represent constituencies. In this debate, Taylor kept sliding right back into that mode. And it's not just progressive language. I could probably get past that if it were just that. But it was the role-confused language. She sounded like someone whose instincts are still identify the good side, identify the bad side, make sure the good side wins. And that might be fine in politics, and it's admirable activism. It might be useful in the legislature, but that's not what I want driving a justice. You could hear it in the way she framed her candidacy. Rights, democracy, protecting people, making government work for people. Fine campaign language. As judicial language, it makes me nervous fast. Courts aren't there simply to produce the outcomes that a judge experiences as just. They're there to decide concrete disputes under law. Their legitimacy depends, at least in part, on being something more disciplined than a permanent policy seminar. And to be fair to Taylor, she's not hiding the ball. One reason Lazar's criticism of Taylor as an advocate instead of a judge landed is because Taylor kept handing her material. Even when Taylor was making points that I probably agree with politically, my reaction was often, "That's not helping. You're confirming the concern." And that's what makes this hard for me. I probably do agree with Taylor politically on most things, but I do not want to reduce a court to which candidate is more on my side. If that's all we're doing, then we're basically admitting that the court is just another political branch wearing a robe. And to me, Taylor's done nothing to indicate that she's going to be anything other than Krofsky Jr. I don't mean that as a bumper sticker insult. I mean that her presentation of the job still feels openly political, openly values driven in a way that suggests she sees the justice seat less as a judicial office than as a place from which to pursue outcomes she already likes. Now, to be fair, Taylor is good at politics. Very good. In the debate, she was sharp. She knew where the soft tissue was. She knew what would motivate the base. She knew how to frame Lazar in a way that was designed to activate the audience she wants. That's a real skill, but it is a skill of a politician. That is really different from having a judicial temperament. So, Lazar, on the other hand, is not some clean answer to all of this. She is not. The strongest thing I can say in Lazar's favor is that she at least says the words that indicate she understands the judicial function. She talks about law, facts, rule, restraint, not legislating from the bench, the difference between being an advocate and being a judge. On that stage, that mattered. She gave answers that tracked the office better than Taylor's often did. And on one issue in particular, I think Lazar got more right than the people attacking her. Taylor repeatedly hammered Lazar over having been reversed by the Wisconsin Supreme Court in the election records litigation case. That sounds devastating in a debate. But if you actually read the cases, and I have, Lazar was doing exactly what a lower court judge is supposed to do. She limited her disagreement with precedent to concurrence, and the substance of her majority decision dealt with matters that went beyond what the other district had decided. So the fact that the Supreme Court slapped her down is not, to me, proof that she was unfit. If anything, that episode struck me as evidence that she was trying to do the job right, and the Supreme Court was doing what appellate courts do sometimes when they're more interested in control than in candor. And that also shows why she got reversed is usually such a stupid talking point in judicial races. Judges get reversed, sometimes because they're wrong, sometimes because higher courts disagree. The Wisconsin Supreme Court itself got reversed by a unanimous U.S. Supreme Court just last year, with none other than Justice Sotomayor writing the decision for the U.S. Supreme Court in the Catholic Charities case. Reversal's part of the system. Taylor used it like a campaign cudgel, and on that issue, Lazar was more right. Lazar also had the better instinct on the whole advocate versus judge distinction when talking about her prior work. When she said that when she was a lawyer at the DOJ, she was an advocate and that her job was to advance her client's position, that was exactly correct. One of the weaker points of Taylor's attack was the suggestion that Lazar's past advocacy for clients somehow proved she was incapable of judging. Lawyers advocate. That is the job. The real question is whether, once on the bench, they transition into the judicial role. And on recusal, Lazar seemed to me to have a much firmer grip. Not just because she gave some beautiful doctrinal exposition, but because she appeared to understand far better than Taylor that recusal isn't just about your own internal confidence in your fairness. It's about public confidence and whether the process looks legitimate. Judges love to say, "Trust me, I can be impartial." And sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. Either way, a judiciary that leans too hard on "just trust me" eventually burns through its own credibility. Lazar seemed to understand that better. So, yeah, Lazar did some things really well, real things, important things. And if I were ever to lean in her favor, it wouldn't be because I suddenly trusted her politics. It would be because I could imagine her maybe being more like Hagedorn than like the justice whose seat she's trying to take. That matters to me. I can live with a conservative. I cannot live with an openly partisan hack on the bench. Hagedorn and I disagree plenty, but he's at least shown a capacity to take the judicial role seriously enough to disappoint his own side. If I thought Lazar was likely to be more like that than Rebecca Bradley 2.0, that would absolutely count for something. I am not saying I'm convinced of that. I am saying that is the best case for her because with Taylor, I don't really see an analogous best case. I don't look at her and think maybe she turns out to be more restrained, more role conscious, more independent from ideological expectations in her camp than she currently sounds. She's given me very little reason to think that. But the case against Lazar is real too. Start with abortion. I think her praise of Dobbs as very wise is very stupid. And I'm choosing those words deliberately. I think Dobbs was wrongly decided. I think that overruling Roe was wrong. I might have more complicated views than some people on the exact doctrinal home for Roe, whether it belongs squarely in the Ninth Amendment or in the penumbras of the 14th. But Dobbs was still wrong, and hearing a candidate for this court talk about it the way Lazar has talked about it is not reassuring. And to be scrupulously fair, Taylor was absolutely right on two major points in the debate. Lazar did call Dobbs very wise. That's not a smear, it is on video. And Taylor was also right that Lazar had said that she wasn't sure that she would be in the majority in Call versus Hermansky. It was the same interview. And Lazar spent the better part of this debate trying to backpedal and smooth over the impression that she left with those earlier statements because she had to. And that matters to me partly because of the substance and partly because it makes me less certain how much weight to put on the cleaner, more restrained version of Lazar presented in the debate. If you're going to be conservative on abortion, own it. Say it plainly. Then explain what you think the judicial role requires. Do not talk one way to one audience and another way to another audience, and then act offended that someone noticed. That doesn't make me think Lazar is uniquely evil or some kind of cartoon villain. It does make me less confident that the judicial restraint language is going to cash out exactly the way her defenders say it will. And that gets to the broader problem I have with Lazar. My dim view of her did not start with this campaign. It began with me reading her work. I've already told you that I publicly criticized one of her opinions as intellectually dishonest. That was City of Hartford versus White. Unpublished, but in my view, not defensible. Go ahead and look it up if you want to see whether it is. So when I watch her campaign and I see a lot of ugly, nasty framing, and when I see her trying to walk this narrow line between sounding judicially restrained and feeding red meat to her own side, it doesn't strike me as some weird anomaly. It fits a concern I already had. So that is the box I end up in. Taylor worries me because she sounds like an advocate who has not really accepted the discipline of judging. And Lazar worries me because, well, she often talks about the judicial role in a way that's more reassuring. I'm not fully convinced that that would actually translate to how she actually does the job. The debate crystallized that pretty well. There were several moments when Lazar was simply right on the institutional point. When she called out the legislative style answers from Taylor, she was right. When she distinguished between what a lawyer does for a client and what a judge is supposed to do once on the bench, she was right. When she suggested that values and causes do not belong at the center of judicial decision making, she was much closer to right than Taylor was. But Taylor had her moments too. She was right to say that Lazar had called Dobbs very wise. She was right to push back against Lazar's evasiveness on Call versus Hermansky. She was right that Lazar's campaign has tried to present her as more neutral than the record really supports. And the uglier truth is that both of them were overly pugnacious. The whole thing had way too much "you're a political hack" and not enough "here's how I understand the limits of judicial power." I get why campaigns devolve into that, especially after watching the last couple of Supreme Court elections. But if you care about the court as an institution, the effect is super depressing. It teaches the public to see the justices as just partisans with more bland clothing. That institutional concern is the center of gravity for me. I'm not approaching this race as a simple question of which candidate is closer to me on the issues. I'm asking which of these people, if either, seems capable of occupying a judicial office without turning it into either a policy cockpit or a performance of restraint that disappears the minute it gets inconvenient. And I don't have a satisfying answer. Some people will hear that and say, come on, man, court's political, judicial elections are political. Everybody knows that. Just pick the one whose outcomes you prefer. I get that argument. I practice in this system. I'm not naive about judges. I know judges are human beings. I know ideology matters. I know values matter. But there's still a difference between acknowledging that judges are not robots and giving up on the judicial role altogether. There is still a difference between a judge who has views and a judge who behaves as though the office exists to advance those views. There's still a difference between understanding that doctrine involves judgment and treating law as branding over politics. If we stop caring about those distinctions, we deserve the judiciary we get. One reason this race frustrates me is that neither candidate inspires much confidence on that front, though they fail in different ways. Taylor's failure is more open, more activist, more visibly representational. Lazar's failure is, I think, that we're rightfully suspicious that she's not as serious about the judicial role as she sounds. So I moved briefly toward Lazar after the debate, and I have moved back away. On the stage, she sounded more institutionally grounded. On some points, like the reversal issue, I thought she was substantively right and unfairly attacked. And if I thought she would end up more like Hagedorn than like Rebecca Bradley, that would be meaningful. But I am not sure of that. And I'm even less sure that Taylor would be anything other than Karofsky Jr. So at this moment, I'm probably staying at home on this race, leaving it blank. I don't like that. I would much rather come down and vote on Tuesday. Maybe I still will, but I'm not going to vote just to vote. If I'm going to vote for someone for a 10-year term on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, I need to be able to say more than this one gave me a slightly lower grade headache. Right now, that's about where I am. Taylor is headed too far in one bad direction, Lazar too far in another. If my destination is Hawaii, Taylor is a ticket to Istanbul, and Lazar is a ticket to Constantinople. For Americans who are bad at geography, those are the same place, and they're very far from Hawaii. So take the plane that gets you closer to your destination does not really solve the problem. The more political these races become, the more we need candidates who show that they understand that the robe is supposed to restrain them, not elevate them. Right now, I'm looking at this race and seeing two people who aren't fit for the role in different ways. One of them is more openly political in a legislative, advocate kind of way. The other more fluent in judicial language and maybe with a little more capacity to be something better, but still carrying real concerns of her own. That is not a good roster. That's an embarrassing one. And still, the seat matters. Court matters. The role matters. That is why I'm wrestling with it instead of pretending not to care. Maybe by Tuesday, I will come down one way or another. I hope I do. I would prefer to vote. I would prefer to be able to tell you that there is a less bad option that I can defend with a straight face, but I am not there yet. That is the honest answer. This is the Anthony John Esquire podcast, and we will see you with